The gym went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from exhaustion or a coach calling a timeout. This was something different, something rarer. The kind of silence that only happens when a group of people who have spent their entire lives mastering something, suddenly realize they are watching a version of that thing they have never seen before. Diana Taurasi was there. Breanna Stewart was there. Aja Wilson was there. Combined, these three women have won Olympic gold medals, WNBA championships, MVP awards, and scoring titles. They have played against the best competition on the planet across multiple decades. They do not get surprised. That is not an exaggeration. It is simply the reality of operating at that level for that long. You stop being surprised because you have seen everything. And then, a 22-year-old stepped back to the logo and released a shot like the distance was completely irrelevant. No wind-up, no visible effort, no moment of hesitation before attempting something that most professional players would not even consider in a live game situation. She just caught it, pump-faked twice, stepped back, and let it go. And the gym filled with athletes who have collectively seen everything, went completely still. That moment was not planned. Nobody scripted it, nobody staged it for a camera. It leaked out of a Team USA training camp that was designed to be a controlled environment, and once it was out, it did not behave like a sports highlight. It behaved like a document. Evidence of something that a very specific group of people sitting in boardrooms far away from that gym floor, had already begun quietly factoring into their calculations. Because what happened in that gym was not just athletic, it was leverage. It was a demonstration, unintentional and therefore completely undeniable, that landed directly in the center of the biggest labor fight women's basketball has ever attempted to run. And if you have been watching this story unfold and sensing that there is a layer nobody is explaining properly, you are right, there is, and it changes everything about how this ends. To understand why that footage carries the weight it does, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning most people know, the Iowa years, the scoring records, the sold-out arenas. The beginning before any of that, when the people whose entire profession is identifying generational talent before it fully develops, looked at Caitlin Clark and got it completely wrong. High school recruiting in women's basketball operates on a system of measurables: height, wingspan, lateral quickness, 40-yard speed equivalents translated into court coverage. The evaluators who assessed Clark coming out of high school ran through that checklist and came back with the same answer from multiple directions: too slow, too slight, too dependent on her shooting. Duke never pursued her seriously. She didn't appear in anyone's top 10 recruiting lists. The professionals looked at a player who would go on to rewrite the history books of her sport and concluded, solid college prospect, probably 4 decent years, nothing beyond that. She committed to Iowa in 2020, not a program known for producing WNBA stars, not a pipeline school with direct connections to professional front offices. Iowa had a loyal fan base and a head coach in Lisa Blutter who believed in her. But by the metrics the recruiting world uses to measure future professional impact, this was not the obvious destination for someone who was going to change the sport. Her freshman season, she averaged 26.6 points per game, and the same people who had underestimated her in high school found new arguments. The Big Ten wasn't the SEC. The competition level wasn't elite enough to take the numbers seriously. The efficiency metrics were inflated by a system that fit her strengths. The skeptics were not silent. They were simply moving the goalposts to a location where they could still be right. Then came her sophomore season, then her junior year. And each time the goalposts moved, Clark followed them down the floor and kept scoring. The arguments kept shifting because the people making them needed them to shift. To admit they had been wrong once was uncomfortable. To admit they had been wrong 3 straight years about the same player was something else entirely. Then came her senior season. Pete Maravich scored 3,677 points in his NCAA career. He did it without a three-point line. He did it in an era before modern defensive schemes, before hand-check restrictions were standardized, before the analytical revolution changed how defenses were designed and deployed. He played in a time when the game was fundamentally different in ways that should have made his record effectively permanent. Maravich held that record for 44 years. Caitlin Clark did not approach it carefully. She did not mount a slow, deliberate pursuit that built media attention over multiple seasons. She arrived at Iowa, started scoring at a pace nobody had seen from a women's player at the college level, and by the time her senior season reached its midpoint, the conversation had shifted from whether she could break it to when. She broke it cleanly, on the road, in a game that was being broadcast nationally, because by that point, her games were always being broadcast nationally. And here is what made that moment different from a simple statistical milestone. The people who had been wrong about her twice, in high school, in her early college years, went quiet. Not because they lacked arguments. The arguments were still technically available. They simply became unusable. You cannot dismiss a player who just broke a record that stood for 44 years in a sport that didn't even have a three-point line when it was set. The rhetorical escape routes were gone. But the record itself was almost secondary to what came with it. Her final college game drew more viewers than any college basketball game in the modern era. Not just more than women's games, more than any college basketball game. Bars that had never considered putting a women's game on their screens called in favors to get the broadcast set up. Sports media organizations that had spent years treating the women's game as a footnote scrambled to catch up to an audience that had already made their decision without them.
The Indiana Fever selected her first overall in the 2024 WNBA draft, and from the moment that pick was announced, the financial structure of an entire professional league began shifting in a direction that could not be reversed. Numbers tell part of the story, context tells the rest. The Indiana Fever, before Caitlin Clark, were averaging attendance figures that reflected a franchise in quiet decline. Games in a half-empty arena, modest local television interest, a loyal but limited fan base that had been waiting years for something to invest in. The Fever selected Clark, and within weeks of her first professional game, those same arenas were selling out, not just in Indiana, everywhere. Opposing teams began reporting their own attendance records when the Indiana schedule came to their city. Teams that had been drawing 4,000 or 5,000 fans to their home games were suddenly fielding calls about additional ticket inventory when the Fever were listed as the visiting team. The product had not changed in those other cities. The rosters were largely the same. The only variable was Clark's presence on the schedule, and that variable was generating the kind of gate revenue that front offices had spent years chasing without results. Sponsors noticed. Companies that had been actively ignoring the WNBA for years, declining meetings, letting sponsorship conversations die quietly, started returning calls. Not all of them, but enough to signal a shift in how the league was being evaluated as a marketing vehicle. The calculation that had kept corporate money away from women's basketball for decades was being revised in real time by people who follow audience numbers for a living and do not ignore what those numbers are telling them. The league's valuation responded accordingly. Analysts began discussing the WNBA in financial terms that would have seemed completely disconnected from reality 5 years earlier. The $2 billion figure that started appearing in coverage was not a projection built on optimistic assumptions about gradual growth. It was a present-tense assessment built almost entirely on what one player had done to the league's revenue profile in a single rookie season. One player, one season, $2 billion in assessed value. The player scouts had dismissed as a decent college option had become the financial engine of an entire professional league. And that reality, that specific, documented, undeniable economic reality, is the exact foundation underneath everything that played out next. The WNBA Players Association entered the 2026 collective bargaining negotiations from a position they genuinely believed was strong. The logic on its surface was straightforward. The league had just come off its most financially successful period in history. Revenue was up, valuations were up, Media attention was at levels nobody had anticipated 2 years earlier. The players who had built the league's culture over the previous decade, veterans who had played through the lean years, who had fought for basic professional conditions, who had kept the sport alive when the financial case for it was genuinely difficult to make, believed this was their moment. They believed the owners could not afford a canceled or shortened season. They believed that the threat of withholding their labor was a threat the other side of the table could not call. They were unified. Public statements from veteran players carried consistent messaging. The union's leadership presented a front that looked organized and resolute. From the outside, this appeared to be a labor action with real structural power behind it. What they failed to account for was geography. Caitlin Clark did not engage in the labor dispute publicly. She did not give interviews analyzing the negotiating positions. She did not post statements. She did not wade into the friction between her and several veteran players that had been building since her rookie season, friction that had generated significant media coverage and significant fan reaction on multiple sides. She did none of that. Instead, she did something that turned out to be far more consequential than any public statement could have been. She showed up to Team USA camp, put on a USA uniform, and played basketball. That was the entirety of her strategic contribution to a negotiation she was technically not even a formal party to, and it was devastating to the union's position in ways that took a few weeks to become fully visible. Team USA camps are designed to be controlled. A national program manages its narrative carefully. Media access is structured and limited. Nothing that happens inside those walls is supposed to become a story unless the program decides it should become one. The coaches control the environment. The communication staff controls the output. Unplanned moments are not part of the model. And yet, when footage from the 2026 camp began leaking onto social media, cell phone clips, second-hand descriptions, reaction videos, the attention it generated had almost nothing to do with the basketball itself. Spectacular plays happen at that level constantly. Elite athletes perform at extraordinary levels every day in training environments that nobody ever sees. A difficult shot going in during a practice drill is not inherently newsworthy in a gym full of Olympic-level talent. What made this footage spread the way it did was the reaction. Watch it carefully. The drill was routine, the kind professionals run hundreds of times each season without a second thought. Clark caught off a screen, used 2 pump fakes to freeze the defender completely, stepped back to the logo, and released. No additional breath, no visible gathering of energy or intentionality for a shot at a distance where most professional players would not even have the confidence to attempt it in a live game situation. She rose and released like the distance was simply not a relevant variable in her decision-making. And across that gym, a gym containing Diana Taurasi, Breanna Stewart, Aja Vilson, and a collection of the most decorated women's basketball players in American history, something specific happened on a lot of faces simultaneously.
There is an expression that appears on elite athletes' faces when they encounter something they were not prepared for. It is not excitement. It is not the performed enthusiasm of a teammate trying to build energy. It is a brief, involuntary stillness. The body processing information the mind was not expecting. Recognition arriving faster than the conscious response to it. You cannot fake that expression, and you cannot manufacture it. It appears when something real has happened. That expression was visible across the entire gym. The veterans did not react with applause or celebration. They reacted with stillness. And that stillness, that specific, unguarded, involuntary moment was what the footage was actually showing. Not the shot, the acknowledgement. Here is the part of this story that has received almost no serious coverage. When that practice footage spread globally, across sports media, general entertainment coverage, international platforms, social feeds in countries that had never had a significant relationship with American women's basketball, the people watching most carefully were not fans. They were not journalists. They were the ownership group on the other side of a labor negotiation that the union believed it was winning. And here is what those owners saw.
They saw the one player responsible for the WNBA's entire valuation leap, the single asset who had transformed the league from a financially marginal product into something serious investors were willing to put real money behind, performing on an international stage in a USA uniform, completely outside league jurisdiction, generating massive audience engagement with no labor conflict anywhere near her image. No drama, no toxicity, no association with the tension that had been dominating WNBA coverage for weeks. They saw that their most important asset was available. She was performing. She was generating the audience numbers that their business model depended on, and she was doing all of it with or without a WNBA season in progress. That realization reframed the entire negotiation. But here is the deeper layer that most coverage has missed entirely. The owners were not simply discovering this information in real time. TNT Sports had already purchased international broadcast rights specifically structured around Clark's participation in Team USA competitions. This was not an accident or a coincidence. It was a contingency plan built before the labor conflict became public, a calculated hedge by a network that had watched unrivaled collapse in the absence of Clark's participation and understood clearly what the lesson of that collapse was. Unrivaled had launched with genuine ambition and genuine talent. The rosters were legitimate, the competition was real. Without Clark, the ratings were not. The audience that had been built around women's basketball during her college and rookie seasons did not transfer automatically to a product she was not part of. That information was not subtle. It was broadcast publicly in the form of viewership numbers that told a very specific story about where the audience actually lived. TNT absorbed that lesson and acted on it. They bought the rights, they built the broadcast around her international availability. If the WNBA season was delayed or canceled entirely, TNT still had their audience draw. They still had the content that their subscribers were actually paying attention to. The union believed they were threatening the product. The network had already insured against that threat before the threat was even formally articulated. The union walked into a negotiation holding leverage over a building the other side had already prepared to exit. The fundamental miscalculation in the union's position was not strategic, it was arithmetic. A WNBA season without Caitlin Clark generates a specific level of television interest, a knowable, historically documented level that can be measured against years of pre-Clark ratings data. A WNBA season with Caitlin Clark generates something categorically different, not an incremental improvement over the baseline, but a transformation of what the product is and what it is worth to the parties paying to broadcast and sponsor it. The owners understood that equation completely. Their objective in the negotiation was never to satisfy the union's demands or find a compromise that left both sides feeling respected. Their objective was to protect the one asset that had made the league into a serious financial product for the first time in its history. And that asset was abroad, untouchable, actively performing and generating the kind of global attention that made any calculation about the leverage of a work stoppage almost irrelevant to the core business question. The union had constructed its leverage argument around the idea that the owners needed them more than they needed a deal. What the footage from that practice camp made undeniable to the owners, to the networks, to the sponsors, and eventually to anyone paying close attention was that the owners needed one specific player more than they needed any particular negotiating outcome. And that player had not joined the work stoppage. She had joined Team USA. The press statements coming out of the union during this period generated almost no audience engagement. The footage from that practice drill spread across every major platform on Earth. Those two data points sitting side by side told the complete story of where the actual power lived in this situation. Go back to that gym one more time.
The veterans who went still when Clark made that shot, they are not villains in this story. They are athletes who gave years of their career to a league that did not pay them what they were worth, in arenas that were not always full, in front of television audiences that the mainstream sports world was not always paying attention to. They built something real under genuinely difficult conditions. The culture of the WNBA, the competitive standard of it, the institutional knowledge embedded in it, that was constructed by those players over decades of work that the financial returns never properly reflected. Their frustration with Clark's arrival and the attention economy that formed around her was not irrational, it was human. Watching a 22-year-old receive the financial and cultural recognition they had spent careers trying to generate for the entire sport, recognition that arrived the moment she walked through the door, rather than after years of investment, is a genuinely complicated thing to process. The criticism some veterans directed at her during her rookie season, however it looked from the outside, came from a real place.
But what happened in that gym was not about any of that history. When the involuntary stillness settled over those faces, it was not about resentment or politics or labor disputes or social media arguments. It was recognition in its purest form. Elite athletes do not lie to themselves about what they are seeing in a competitive environment. The performance evaluator inside them operates independently of their personal feelings about the person performing. They saw what she is. And in that moment of recognition, something shifted that cannot be shifted back. The chapter they had built, the era in which veteran influence shaped the league's culture through seniority, through unwritten rules about deference and hierarchy, through collective control of what the WNBA's identity was allowed to be, that chapter was not ending because of a press release or a contract dispute. It was ending because of a logo step back in a practice drill that a gym full of elite athletes could not pretend they had not seen. When this negotiation concludes, through a deal, a shortened season, a restructured agreement, or whatever shape the eventual resolution takes, the league that exists on the other side will not be the league that existed before Caitlin Clark's rookie season. The financial architecture will be different. The power relationships inside the locker room will be different. The media infrastructure surrounding the game will be different. The audience expectations will be different. These are not predictions about a possible future. They are descriptions of changes that have already happened and cannot be undone regardless of how this particular negotiation resolves. What the market has decided, and it has decided this twice now, once during Clark's rookie season and again when Unrivaled demonstrated the limits of her absence, is that there is one name in women's basketball right now that functions as a genuine crossover cultural force. Not just a great player, not just a compelling athlete, a figure who changes the economic equation of any product she is attached to and exposes the fragility of any product she is not. That is a once-in-a-generation reality, sometimes less frequent than that. The athletes who carry that kind of cultural gravity, who function not just as performers, but as the gravitational center that holds an entire sport's mainstream moment together, are extraordinarily rare. And the institutions lucky enough to have one of them operating inside their structure face a choice between building around that reality or being reorganized by it. The WNBA's ownership group has made its choice visible through their behavior in this negotiation. The veterans in that gym made their acknowledgement visible through their involuntary silence. The networks made their position visible through the broadcast rights they purchased before anyone publicly admitted what was really at stake. The era of veteran-controlled locker room hierarchy as the dominant power structure in women's basketball is giving way, not to a different person holding the same kind of power, but to something the market has already made its decision about. Revenue has a name, it has a number on its jersey, and apparently, it has a shooting range that stops practice cold and makes the most decorated athletes in the sport forget, just for a moment, that they were supposed to have seen everything. Here is what this story is actually about, underneath all the basketball and the contract language and the television rights negotiations. It is about what happens when a single person becomes more valuable to an institution than the institution's own rules about how value is supposed to be distributed. It is about what happens when the market makes a decision and the people most affected by that decision have to stand in a gym and watch the evidence of it released from behind the three-point line without any effort at all. The veterans built this sport under conditions that deserved better reward than they received. That is true, and it matters. The union's desire for financial structures that reflect the current value of the product is legitimate, That is also true, and it also matters. None of that changes what that footage revealed. The balance of power in women's basketball has shifted. It shifted in a training gym that was supposed to be a controlled environment. It shifted in the boardrooms of networks that were supposed to be threatening to leave. It shifted in the valuations of a league that was supposed to be fighting for basic recognition a decade ago. And it shifted in the faces of athletes who have spent their entire careers refusing to be surprised. They were surprised anyway. What comes next will be built on that moment, whether anyone involved wants to acknowledge it or not. The sport is being carried toward a future that the previous generation helped build, but no longer controls. And the person doing the carrying is not making speeches about it. She is not posting about it. She is just stepping back to the logo and letting it go. Every single time.